Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue au Forum syndical
Good
international.
morning, all. Welcome to the International Trade Union Forum on Ecological and Social Transition. This forum has started at the beginning of this week. It is the result of preparatory work bringing together 650 participants who have worked. They come from all over the world. And this forum will continue until tomorrow. Some 5,000 people took part in the discussion coming from 50 different countries. Now, this forum is organized by different organizations: CGT, the Global Labor Institute Paris, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the Alter Summit Network, and TUED, the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. So welcome to all of you. Now, you have a possibility to use the chat button. It's mentioned at the bottom of the screen, discussion, that's your chat button. And you can ask the questions you wish or make the comments you wish. And now, Arthur, you are responsible for this panel discussion. I'll leave you the floor. Thank you. Thank you very much. Today, we will talk about national actions and see how transnational issues can be dealt with at national level. And we certainly are going to seek some transnational response to national issues. We will hear about different transnational actions that were led in different continents. And we will also be talking about national actions. Now, how are we going to go about it? We are going to have 5 presentations from the UK, the Philippines, France, Russia, and another country, and they will present to us different views from different organizations. And they will have about 10 minutes to speak and make a short presentation. At any time, you can ask your questions in the chat. So please make sure you ask questions that are focused on the experience of the speakers. And of course, if anybody wants to come in and make some contribution, that is also a possibility. If anybody is prepared to answer the questions that appear in the chat, please go ahead. Now, to inaugurate this panel discussion, I would like to ask Mitzi to please start. You're part of the Friday for Future, and you were in charge of organizing different strikes for climate, and you did that in a very successful way. Please, Mitzi, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I am Mitzi Janelle Pan. I am from the Philippines. My organization is called Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, but it's basically the Fridays for Future in the Philippines. And I want pretty disconnected with each other. And it isn't surprising because of how spontaneous everything was. The way that the youth climate movement just grew and started popping up in different places pretty spontaneously really just showed how the youth had this clamor for change and that all we wanted to do was go out in the streets for collective action. We started with simple calls such as climate action and that the climate crisis is a far off problem in the future that we need to look at. And yet, as we've grown in the past years, as we've connected more with each other, especially with the shift to digital spaces where, because of the pandemic, there was this unique opportunity where there were no physical borders. Everyone could join each other's actions. Everyone could connect with one another, and no matter where they're from. Which, of course, there are still some limitations with time zones, language, and internet connection, but there was a great move forward. And that's when we started seeing these real connections with each other, and activists from the global north and global south, or most affected peoples and areas, or MAPA. And we started having these actual conversations with each other and not just reading about the other on the news or on social media. And we started to really connect and build better narratives that were more specific and more centered on messages of justice and solidarity and international unity. And that, I think, is the beauty of the Fridays for Future youth movement, that we may not have started the best way. I think as any international movement, in any movement, it does start very spontaneously and sometimes not necessarily the best way, but we're able to keep growing and to keep learning and to keep connecting to each other despite the cultural differences, despite the language barriers, because we know that there is a need to unite. And we've done this pretty well, I would say, across the global south and global north climate activist groups. But there is a chance now for us to go beyond just youth climate activists. At this point, with the rising climate injustice that's also being impacted by other socioeconomic crises of the world, such as sexism, racism, fascism, class inequality, and the health pandemic, we are seeing that these issues are intersectional and play into one another and pile up and are all perpetrated by the same system that we live in. And so us youth climate activists, it's now our time to really join the struggle and the movement of the people, of the workers, of our farmers, of our indigenous peoples, and really connect with more people and connect with the masses. We've done a lot in terms of changing public perception, seeing that the climate crisis isn't a problem of the future. It's happening already today in the global south. Now we need to change the perspective to show that it isn't just the problem of environmentalists. It isn't just the problem of youth climate activists, but we have to connect with every sector of society and let the most marginalized sectors of society really lead the way. Because if we don't do that, once again, we'll have the same system where the people least responsible and most marginalized will be left behind. And so that is, I think, the beauty of a youth climate movement and any youth movement, is that we are so willing to learn and adapt quickly because we see the urgency and the need to adapt. And I think that's something that everyone can really learn from youth movements, not just the youth climate movement of Fridays for Future, but youth movements in general, that we grow together, we connect with one another, we learn from our mistakes, we learn from each other, and we connect with more people. And it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be a very, very difficult road to get there. We are going to fight with each other. We are going to fight with other people and fight with other groups. But the important thing is that we move forward, that we are always willing to talk to each other and we remember what unites us and we hold on to that. And we strengthen these unities and deepen them from what was before just climate action and urgency, going into climate justice, going into intersectionality, and going more and more into seeing that the better future that we're fighting for is a future for all. And so we need everyone with us.
Merci beaucoup, Mitzi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mitzi. That was a very enthusiastic and interesting contribution, and we can see that there is some ambition not only at national level but at transnational level. And you highlighted the fact that the struggle of the people trying to defend the climate have some connection with workers who struggle at other levels. And regarding the questions or the messages, they can be found in the chat. And for the time being, we will leave them there and try and see and answer them later on. Let us now give the floor to Frédéric Magnin from Sud-PTT. He's going to talk about strikes in call centers. Frédéric, you now have the floor. Frédéric Madelin. Microphone, please, Frédéric Madelin. Your microphone is muted at the moment. Frédéric. Oh, very sorry. I was on the wrong conference. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me try and explain why we try to develop the international component in our trade union. Well, we work with call centers. We are the ones that receive your call whenever there is a problem, etc. And this is an activity which happens worldwide. You can work at the same time, more or less, in Paris or in Peking, Beijing, or in other parts of the world. So when there is a strike in France, for instance, our calls can actually be rerouted to a different destination. And that is a problem because, as you can imagine, delocalizing call centers is very easy. Anyway, I'd like to give you an example of the number one in this sector, Télé-France. 380,000 people are working for there. It was represented in well over 100 countries, and they're using well over 100 different languages. Now, we trade unions need to organize ourselves at the same level. We need to have the same scale because it's otherwise very difficult to be able to play a role. Now, we have started working for a number of years already, be it at European level or at world level, and we've REACT, for example, worked on telecoms in Morocco. There are different actors who are already working. So we set up a network which was trying to actually be active and do or take concrete actions. We tried to be we tried to work with active employees rather than focus on the top levels. We tried to have concrete actions, and through that, we managed to establish some links, and we launched a symposium concerning working conditions, and there were several hundreds of representatives from Madagascar, from Tunisia, and from many different countries. And we tried to work together for 3 days, and we tried to see how we could think of a more global approach regarding the way these call centers are being dealt with. And we try to be more reactive to the problems which had been highlighted. Anyway, after this symposium, there was a sort of worldwide approach of all call centers. And we've taken other actions. We have organized some demonstrations. Some workers had gone on a hunger strike after trying to renegotiate their salaries. So we tried to bring together a lot of people. We tried to bring hundreds of people in front of the headquarters of Téléperformance. And in France, we had been working with works councils, and we brought people together in front of the headquarters, and we tried to support our colleagues in Tunisia. We did the same a few months ago or a few years ago with a company called Armatis. And we also conducted actions in Europe with our colleagues from Spain and also in Tunisia. In Brussels, we had a demonstration concerning European legislation relating to customers' relations. So generally speaking, we tried to establish a parallel between the struggle on the one hand and between information and training amongst ourselves. For example, we had a meeting on collective bargaining in Tunisia. More recently, we had a meeting in Cameroon. Several hundreds of people working for Intelsia were trained as to how you can actually struggle or take part in struggles. We did that with Cameroon trade unions. We also worked with another trade unions. Generally speaking, we tried to work on the two approaches at the same time, how to demonstrate or how to take actions and how to organize ourselves. We've also organized trade unionists that were young people below the age of 30. They were from Tunisia, from Belgium, from other places in France. And we had 3 different dates. We met in Paris, in Tunis, in Brussels. We also tried to establish some links between different operators in the same sector, try to exchange economic information and follow up on what is taking place. Now, more recently, we've had to work all together because of COVID pandemic. We had a petition with several thousands of signatures which were gathered. We tried to work at different levels. In the Philippines, for example, we asked the Philippine employees to work, and well, they were asked to work and continue to work and sleep at the same place. In Cameroon, in Palestine, in Belgium, there were lots of trade unions who signed this petition to counter this situation. And this led to a major strike in 3 countries, France, Tunisia, and Morocco, following the collective bargaining which had taken place in Tunisia. The management refused actually to increase their salaries, and the same had happened in France. And so a strike was called in March at the same time, simultaneously, plus a video conference on Zoom, bringing together all workers from those 3 countries, which I've just mentioned. This has put a lot of pressure on management, and the day before the strike should have taken place, they actually gave in. Now, it was not possible to have calls between Morocco, Tunisia, and France. And we know that the French market is supplied by Tunisia and Morocco in terms of call centers, essentially. Eventually, there was this video conference with 7,000 employees which attended. That was really an achievement. We were quite happy with that action. And to sum up, I'd like to say that we have 2 or 3 major trade unions. We're working essentially on 15 different countries. And what we're trying to do is bring together information and training. We provide each other a lot of information about the software which is being used. And then we try and organize ourselves to actually launch actions at the same time. Now, because of the pandemic, we were not able to organize a big symposium, but we plan it in France with all the things I've mentioned earlier. Thank you. Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you. Congratulations.
When you work for a company which works over 170 people, it's a huge challenge to have everyone gather. You spoke about environmental activism, gender balance. It is quite positive. I forgot to introduce myself, so I'm going to do so now. I recognize some faces, so I forgot to do that. I'm a delivery man. We also have different companies in the same system. And the first time we met with comrades from other countries, Platform would tell us, well, in your country, you're in a very good situation compared to other countries. And in fact, they always tried to make us feel in a good position, but when we could speak with our fellow comrades, we could see straight away that this was not true. And so we had first information and then action. And in between that, you had a lot of things to organize, organizing, go in the street. So major actions were needed. And for these major actions, let me give the floor to Beatriu from the organization of Intersindical Valenciana Mujeres. I give you the floor. She has to answer an emergency call, so she'll come back in a few minutes. Perhaps we could, she'll come back in 10 minutes time. Very good. So we'll give the floor to the next one. Ivan Merit from Novoprov, member of KTR, the Labor Federation of Russia, the second biggest union in the country, an organization which works a lot for the defense of migrants, but also for many other issues. You have the floor, Ivan.
There is no sound.
Sorry, Ivan.
Okay, let us start once more. Okay, let us try again. In fact, the organization and the work with migrants in Russia represents a lot of work. There are a lot of migrants in the great towns, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg. A lot of those migrants work in the construction sector, but also in the hospitality sector and restaurants and in trade in general, in retail trade. There are no major requirements as far as employers are concerned. There are no ecological requirements. It's very difficult to organize these migrant workers. If we want our trade unions to be active, to be viable, we need to actually employ those young migrant workers. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to enroll them. That is not the only reason, but essentially we are actually enrolling these migrant workers in our trade union organizations. And of course, amongst those members of the trade unions, there are Russian people as well, of course. We try to avoid stigmatizing these migrants. We want to make sure they are actually included, that they are not stigmatized. And that is why we want them to be part of the same trade union organization. We want to avoid splitting them. It's a very complicated approach. It's a complicated work. These migrant workers might actually have belonged to a trade union organization in their original country. When they go back home, we'd like to know where they're off to. It's very complicated to follow this up and to gather information. Now, when we try to enroll these migrant workers, we try to gather information, and we've been able to observe that there are some differences. If you compare today's situation to what happened 10 years ago, well, migrant workers used to come to Russia and they would just take any job that was offered to them. Whereas nowadays, the work which migrant workers look for will mean that they actually have some know-how. For example, some migrants come to work as a chef in a restaurant. In fact, what happens is that whatever they do when they work in Russia is the same profession they have when they go back home. For example, if somebody arrives and works in the building sector, they go back home and they continue working in the building sector, although they may originally have been a taxi driver. So what is happening is that the people will continue working for the same sectoral trade unions. And if they work in a restaurant, they go back home and they can continue being a member of a hospitality sector trade union. So this is really interesting and makes things easier. And we believe that it will be possible to actually recruit more migrant workers in this way, in a more appropriate way. And as far as issues like ecology or environment protection is concerned, presently migrant workers are not very interested in this aspect, the environment, for example. They are looking for a job, they are looking for a salary. So I just wanted to say this, and if there are any questions, I'm at your disposal. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Ivan, et désolé pour les problèmes techniques.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and sorry for the little technical hitches. Thank you very much for your testimony and the answers you gave us about how can we get organized internationally and why. We spoke about what we did, but you do something quite amazing. How can we make sure we don't lose a member when he's going to change country? It is a very interesting aspect of unionism. How can we make sure we still remain connected? Perhaps such members go back to Russia afterwards in a different city. And we do understand what you've told us about priorities, the importance of wages. So environment without fighting for classes is like gardening. Some would like to just use their bikes, but it is impossible to have to do 150 kilometers a day to earn your living. So it is important to take into account the environment and social issues. So I'm told that Beatriu is back. I had already introduced Beatriu from the Intersyndical Valenciana Mujeres. So you have the floor. Spoiler alert is really a great success.
Thank you so much, Arthur, for giving me the floor, and thanks to all the comrades that have spoken before me, and thanks to all the people who have been involved in the organization of this wonderful forum. And let me thank especially Sebastian Franco from Alter Summit. Dear comrade, and it's a pity that we can't see each other due to the pandemic. It's only a screen thing rather than the face-to-face meetings that we used to have. Well, my role here is to talk about how the feminist movement organized 2 worldwide global strikes. And I've been quite impressed by Mitzi and Ivan before me, because well, I had to take a phone call and I couldn't listen to anything, but I think they didn't mention the feminist movement. And I'm surprised because still nowadays, even in contexts of ideologically marked people who are fighting for your rights in general, still not misregard, but still still do not consider feminism as one of the core global movements. Because I'm very proud to say that for almost 3 centuries now, it's been women globally the ones who have been fighting for our rights, with less or more ways to connect to each other. Because, you know, back in the last decades of the 18th century, there were connections between feminists, basically between feminists from the United States of America and the United Kingdom. And you know, imagine that those times, you know, back in almost in French Revolution, how could we connect globally in such a world in which there was no telegraph and of course no telegram or WhatsApp or the internet. No? And it's a way, you know, this initial comment is not that I'm angry with any of you, of course not. It's just that we have to enrich each other, and all the ecological women and labor movements, we have to mirror each other, and we have to think that we're not alone, that our fight against capitalism will not succeed if we don't fight against patriarchy, and that fight will not succeed if we don't fight colonialism too. And well, with that in mind, the feminist movement has had several waves, many of them, or most of them, relying on facts of women in what is called the first developed countries. I don't like that term, and I only use it if I can explain that those developed countries are so because we have been exploiting countries which we haven't allowed to develop properly. Okay, so taking that into account and also focusing on how important feminism in those countries that the West hasn't allowed to develop are emerging, and in fact silenced. If feminists are silenced, imagine the feminist movement in countries in which there is an enormous capitalist exploitation by the West. So imagine, and we've got super strong women fighting in India, in Arabic countries, in Tunisia, and in Peru, in Guatemala, in Colombia. We've got wonderful, enormous groups of women fighting for their rights. So I would like to mention that, and I don't know if I'm taking a lot of time, but I want to reinforce the idea that we must join all the struggles together. And that's pretty much what we women did. Of course, it was a bit easier for us to organize something globally. And the first female global strike was as far back now as 2018. And I say as far back because due to pandemic, you know, it seems that 1 year has lasted 1 decade. And we've lost too many things and too many rights on the pandemic way. And well, how could we manage to organize that? Mainly because there is feminist movement to some extent with different levels, of course, but there is feminist movement almost in every country in the world. No matter if they are not structured as an organization, no matter if they are not structured as an organization, there is always a group of women who stick together, who gather together to help each other and to give mutual support. That is feminism. No matter if we're talking about women walking together kilometers and kilometers to pick up water in Nigeria, or if we're talking about migrant women in Spain fighting for their rights as fundamental carers of our elderly, for instance. That is feminism, how women, we can join together to be able to first talk about our problems, second, to think about or to reckon or to even make a collective thinking of why do we have those problems, and that is because we suffer the most systematic repression, which is the repression of patriarchy against women. And number 3, the most important thing, so we talk, we think about what is happening, we talk about what's happening to us, we think about what is happening to us, and the third and the most important, in my opinion, we just take the streets to claim for our rights, no matter the extent. And well, the Spanish state has a very solid feminist movement, and that is partly caused by the repression that we suffered on the on the middle part of last century, of the 20th century, in which we had a fascist dictatorship in Spain. And basically after, you know, basically in the decade of the 70s, it was when the Spanish feminist movement got, you know, a bigger strength. And that means that we are later than, for instance, in France or in the United Kingdom. But on the contrary, that has made us more durable now. And the thing is that, as I said, it was a bit easier for us because it is clear for all women that we are suffering repression. And it is thanks to that awareness, that collective and individual awareness, that there was a claim to do something, all of us. The first strike in 2018 was basically followed in the Spanish state and in Argentina. That was the beginning. That was, let's say, the trigger of it all. But some other countries joined us too. Brazil, Portugal, at some extent Italy, at some extent Greece, especially in Athens. There was some nice work being done also in Brussels, thanks to Alta Summit, and of course it was France too joining. But the thing is that we didn't want to restrict that strike just to a labor strike. This is why we call that feminist strike and not only labor strike. We structured that both strikes on 2018 and 2019, we structured them in 4 different axes, 4 branches. One was labor, of course. Women, we are underpaid. There's a gender gap in our salary, so there is objective reasons so that we go on strike. That was labor. Then we had student strike. So for women, many women in the world, is more access to schooling and to university is more difficult. So we organized a student strike all on the same day on March the 8th. Then we had consumer strike because for capitalism we are a market niche. Now everything, all branches or brands seem to love violet. Everything is violet, everything is pink, because, you know, women, we are almost half citizenship in the world. In Europe, we are a bit more than half. And, you know, it's obvious that the importance that we've got. So we also planned a consumer strike. And the 4th branch of them all, and probably the most important, was the caring strike. Because women all over the world carry the burden of caring. That means domestic work, taking care of the family, of the home, and of other people in general. In fact, many of the jobs that we usually have are strictly related to caring. This is why there are more women teachers, nurses, doctors, social services workers, or even cleaners. So, and even in supermarkets or in the food industry, there are more women. So there are still a lot of feminized jobs. And that's when that caring goes outside. But when it is inside, it means that most women around the world, what they do is, after they have worked outside, and many times with, well, most of times with poorer conditions that our male counterparts, apart from doing that work outside, they have to work inside. And that means that instead of having an 8-hour working day, most of them have a 16-hour working day. And it was important for us to make that visible, to make it visible that on that March the 8th, we wouldn't work at home either. And this is why we hanged our aprons in our windows and balconies, just to show the world that what we do is important, even if it's, you know, inside those 4 walls that we've got at home, and that what we do is important. And it was curious to how to perceive what women thought about that, because many of them were saying, oh my God, I'm worried, who will take my children home to school, and who will get them back? And it was just like, it was a way also that that many men realized inside their homes how important what their wives or partners do. And let me tell you that thanks to that starting point in 2018, women, at least in Spain, have been more visible in everyday media agenda. Before that massive movement, it was just like women were only part of the news on November the 25th for it's the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and on March the 8th, which is the International Women's Day. But now in Spain, for instance, most sports news include female sport. That was absolutely unthinkable before 2018. And that's just, a detail, because there's a long way to go. But even if not many workers actually went on labor strike, I'm finishing, it was a way in which we could visibilize each other. And things have changed ever since. Pandemic has represented, a backlash on some of our rights, but still the changes in individually and collectively after those female women strikes, I think that they will still prevail, and it is our job, in unions worldwide and feminist worldwide, just to keep that flame alive. And I will stop. Okay, I've taken a bit too much. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Béatrice. Non, tu peux pas trop parler quand tu
Thank you, Beatrice. You can never speak too long.
There's
Far
no
from
problem.
it is
We
extremely
have limited time, but
interesting.
not
It's
about,
really
not concerning this subject. This was very interesting, and you
full of
discussed a
enthusiasm.
world
You
problem,
speak about
as you
this
rightly
huge problem,
reminded us.
half of the world population.
Women represent half
And what is at
this
stake
planet's
goes
population,
beyond
and
the
because of
company.
that, certainly we need to take it into consideration. It is sometimes difficult, and trade unions need to take that movement into consideration, and certainly it is important to take that dimension into consideration. Well, as I said earlier, there is a possibility to ask questions through the chat, but of course you have the possibility, of course, of coming in on specific aspects. It's sometimes difficult to organize the question and answer session, but certainly in the chat there are, I'm sure, a lot of issues that are of great interest to all of you. Let me now give the floor to Ryan Hayes. He works for the ITF, the International Transport Federation. And Ryan is going to discuss with us his organization and what they do. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you for having me, and thank you to all of my co-panelists for such interesting comments so far. And maybe before I start talking a little bit about the International Transport Workers Federation and our work with food delivery riders in the gig economy, I thought I just could pick up on some of the threads of, I think, commonality in the analysis I've heard from some of our panelists. I want to start by just thanking Beatrice for bringing up the gender dimension which is so crucial in the feminist movement, and the point about how our movements must be connected. I'm currently based in Canada, and the head of our gig workers union is actually a woman. She was recently, the president was recently elected, and I think that's quite an impressive thing. Many people know that, in the food delivery sector, it does appear, at least visibly, to be predominantly men, but a lot of that is because of the structural challenges in this highly precarious work, where the safety of workers is not protected. There are issues of harassment on the streets and a lack of basic access to things like bathrooms. So I'm really happy to see, the feminist dimension being put in the forefront of this work. And similarly, it was great to hear from Ivan about the work in Russia and the crucial aspect of migrant workers as well, which is a huge part of the food delivery sector. And I hope to touch on that a little bit. But I also just want to share my sort of full agreement with the analysis shared by Frederick in terms of the need to organize at the same scale and level of the companies that we're facing. And again, in the gig economy, many of these companies are international, multinational companies. So our organizing also must be transnational, which is why I think the topic of this panel today is so great. And lastly, I just wanted to say my work within the ITF, I'm based in the youth department. So I also want to agree with what Mitzi shared in terms of the importance of learning from the youth movement. We have a lot to learn in the labor movement from the youth movement, and the spontaneity of young people organizing, their ability to learn and adapt quickly, I think are really amazing skills that we can learn from. Okay, so now just to say a little bit about food delivery riders. I think it's a very interesting sector. It's one that I think is already very transnational in character. And part of that, I think, is, as we've discussed, because a lot of the companies themselves are international and are competing with each other globally for market share and capital investment. But second, it's also a very transnational sector because many of the food delivery riders themselves, due to their own lived experience, for example, as migrants, see themselves as part of a transnational reality. And again, many of these workers, whether migrant or not, also see their work in the gig economy as a key battleground for the future of labor, which is also connected to the future of our planet and this ecological question. So I just want to give one example before I get into one from our work, but just to say, you know, last week I saw on Twitter that there was a food delivery rider who was fired in Berlin working for a grocery delivery platform called Gorillas. The workers in Berlin started protesting. They went to the Gorillas warehouse and they put this on Twitter. And within hours, riders in London in the UK showed up. These were workers with the IWGB, the Independent Workers of Great Britain. They showed up at this company's warehouse in London and protested in solidarity. And I think this is a testament to the nature of the transnational bonds that are being built in the food delivery sector. To share one more example, just as the ITF, one thing that we've been doing since November last year is bringing together riders from different unions under the banner of Rights for Riders, a network of food delivery riders in different countries around the world. Initially, our focus was sort of handed to us. There was a sense of urgency because one of the major companies, Deliveroo, which is backed by Amazon, who's one of their major investors, decided that they were going to capitalize on the pandemic and the increased business they were seeing by listing themselves on the London Stock Exchange and deciding to try to get billions of dollars from public investors because this was a good time for them. But of course, many riders were incredibly upset by this because they had been struggling through the pandemic without being provided personal protective equipment in conditions where they're often misclassified and told that they're, you know, independent contractors when in fact they are workers who are being denied their rights. And so unions started to approach us and we asked how we could support this effort. And one of the things we thought as a global union was we could help to facilitate meetings, provide translation, help develop communication materials, and a space for discussion where we could try to identify some shared demands that would make sense across our different contexts. And so through a process of meetings, which uniquely for us included both traditional unions, which are already affiliated to the ITF, but also new and emerging grassroots unions, riders unions that have sort of spontaneously organized, we brought together these groups to discuss, to come up with our common platform and launch a public campaign. And one of those pieces was a global day of action that we did on March 26th. And I want to commend our comrades at the CGT because they were one of the first to respond to that call to action. And they came out and organized in Lyon and Bordeaux, Toulouse, Poitiers to show their solidarity with food delivery riders around the world. And I thought that was really impressive to see, you know, across time zones from Australia to France, to Italy, to Spain, to see people taking action. And this culminated with a strike in the United Kingdom on April 7th, which is the headquarters of Deliveroo in the UK. And this was also the same day that they were listing themselves on the stock exchange. And it was quite a vindication for us because we had been raising noise about the working conditions. The workers' voices were changing the narrative about this company. And it actually meant that the company lost $3 billion in its valuation within hours, because basically many investors said, we don't want to invest in a company that is openly exploiting workers' rights and refusing to sit down with workers to talk about improving their conditions. And so I think this was a really, I think, will serve as a powerful example for the other gig companies. It's, I think, a lesson to say you have to engage with workers. You may be a global company, but we're also a global movement, and we're a force to be reckoned with. Thank you very much.
Merci, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. I don't know whether Deliveroo will be able to live after this blow, but that was an excellent example of what can be done. And it was really interesting to see how the work at legal level also of trade unions enabled to go that far. So there was also this international mobilization of a strike, and it was possible actually to destabilize a major company, and which was aiming to go on to be in the stock exchange. So that was really remarkable. Now, at the very beginning, I mentioned there would be 5 speakers. We had a little glitch with Ivan from Russia, but I believe that Nicolas can now take the floor and tell us what he's been doing in the field of environment. Nicolas, you have the floor. Yes, hello. Good afternoon to all. Thank you very much for having organized this webinar. I must say these various examples are really very interesting. My organization is called 360.org. We work in the field of climatic change, in particular in the field of fossil energy, and we're trying to actually move on beyond coal and oil, but we do it in the name of climatic justice. We want to make sure that nobody is left behind, and also in particular those who presently work in those sectors. Now, let me say a few words about the way the climate movement has actually developed international mobilizations and see what type of alliances can be built upon that. Now, let me start by saying that the movement for climate has enabled to mobilize a great number of people. We had a spike in September 2019 when 7 million people worldwide went in the street on 20 and 27th November 2019. That is a little bit like the mobilization in 2003 or 2004 against the Iraq war. So it was really a huge event, amongst the widest mobilization in history. But having said that, for quite a long time, a lot of these climate mobilizations were directly linked to international events, international conferences. That has often been the case. And that is a situation which we share in the field of climate with those who actually want to promote a different world, the ultra-mundialist system. So very often we use these big international events, a big conference, a big symposium, etc. And that is what we do. That is what was done with the for the WTO, the World Bank meetings, or EU gatherings. Well, of course, then there was the World Social Forum, which was set up, and things moved differently. So it's really interesting. In the climate sector, we realized that there were some limits to moving in this way, also due to the fact that you had to focus on these conference. Now, what the WTO is concerned, we don't want the IMF, we don't want neoliberal policies, and that's not our thing. The climate issue is far more complicated. We are in favor of a certain process, which is that of transition, is good according to us. We believe that we should certainly make sure that those who are the least responsible for climatic change should receive some compensations, and those who pollute most should make more efforts. The problem is that the whole process is not institutionalized, but we're certainly not following the same rationale as those who just want to get rid of the WTO. No, we have a very different approach. So it leads us to having to adopt very complicated process. What do? Do you keep a link with the existing process, etc.? We don't just want to get rid of it. Now, the climate process I'm referring to was set up in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. That's nearly 30 years ago. And the idea was to bring the world community to reduce its greenhouse gases. You know, we had witnessed at the time a very high release of greenhouse gases. And so that was the decision that was made. Then there were some movements in 2010, for instance, which developed the organization 350.org is one of those organizations which actually decided on certain things, for instance, relating to the institutions that deal with climate aspects. We decided the UN alone are not the ones that can take the direction. There are also a lot of other institutions, banks, for example, that fund fossil energy activities, etc. So there are other possibilities to target. We can, for example, target these banks that continue funding fossil energy activities. And there are other things that can be done at more local level. In France, La ZAD from Notre-Dame-des-Landes, it's an area which was a major focus for 40 years in the western part of France, where people demonstrated. In Germany as well, one forest is probably going to be destroyed to enable a coal mine to continue flourishing. In the United States, there were similar examples, and we believe we can work locally there. In more southern areas, there are mega projects concerning the coal industry or other activities, including renewable energies, mega projects. There were some mega dam projects in India, for example, in the 70s. So there are lots of things that can be done. And so we observe that at the beginning, the so-called Alter Summit and the climate activists, they were actually speaking the same language. But now, as far as the climate is concerned, we have a different approach. We have a different sort of territory. We try to work much more locally in a focused way. And for example, there was a pipeline project in the northern part of the US, and very quickly people mobilized. It also was linked with the rights of native people, etc. So there was a direct focus action. Still in the climate movement, 3 years ago, there was Fridays for Future. Metsi mentioned it. I won't speak too long about it, but there is this mass movement, and Fridays for Future enables us to mobilize tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people in a very regular way. And this is completely outside of the institutional approach. And the climate day has become Friday, or whether there's a COP or whether there's a UN meeting, it doesn't matter. Young people decided not to go to school on a Friday, fine. And so it's really become enshrined. Now, this tipping didn't happen that easily. In fact, initially, it's the countries from the south that are in favor of the climatic justice. It was in Bali, in Indonesia, in 2008 that the basic principles of climate justice were decided. And a lot of the countries which signed this agreement are countries from the south. Then Fridays for the Future has moved this situation. We've got a tipping from the south to the north, and we see that it's more middle classes or upper classes, or young people from middle classes, upper classes that have been very active in those activities, at least in the first month after Fridays for Future was set up, and in the first year at least. And then little by little, there is a leadership of Fridays for Future, which has also appeared everywhere else in the world, and things are being slightly changed in terms of mobilization, because since the emergence of Fridays for Future, it is possible to develop mass mobilizations for climate justice. And it's completely independent from the institutional agenda. And essentially, it's become more democratic geographically. And we have really made some major progress as far as that is concerned. So we need to combine these mass activities with demonstrations, which generally speaking go beyond going in the street. We have to focus on specific disasters, on specific activities. Some people say that unless public policies are changed rapidly, we're actually going to hit the wall. We can't say that and then try and mobilize people to go in the street. We have to reorganize things from a tactical point of view and from a strategic point of view as well. And of course, there are other challenges, which is that we try to bring together the different approaches and the different traditions. The idea is to enlarge the climate movement. And this is where discussions with trade union movements is really important. We want to talk with the people representing trade unions, because I must admit that so far talking about climate, when we talk about job, labor, it's just one measure. And we when we say, you know, on the French platform that 1 million jobs will be created for climate, we have to be much more focused and see how the more polluting sectors can move into non-polluting sectors. But essentially, we're actually at that level talking about measures that can be taken. And so the concept of labor, the concept of a job must be transformed to be able to push governments into making some decisions, because when we talk about these jobs, they are not just accessory, they are really important. They are the structuring element of the claims, which are the claims we are trying to push forward. And if it is possible both to become more radical in our mass mobilization, and if we are able to establish closer links with the various parties involved, we will be able to create this strength we need to change. And of course, there is the aspect relating to the young generation, and this has been mentioned by several speakers. The fact that the climate movement is really being pushed forward by young people means there will be no going back to what we knew before. they're going to continue pushing it forward. So the organization 350.org, well, I must say I'm quite happy with these big mass movements we've been able to mobilize. In 2019, 7 million people went on the street to demand climate justice. Now people were mobilized in Lebanon, in Chile, in Hong Kong, in South America. And if you count the Gilets jaunes as well, I believe we're actually going beyond these 7 million people I've just mentioned. And our friends from trade unions, our comrades are well aware of the fact that the mass is really critical if we want to have some influence on the purchasing power or whatever. But so far, nothing was achieved that was as important as we managed to do in the field of climate. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for such a thorough explanation and for telling us about this movements. We are faced with a strongly organized production system. We must put an end to it. We must put an end to profits. And if they only understand fear, we need to activate such mass movements. I fully agree with you. We still have 45 minutes. So what I suggest now, after the speakers took the floor, we may have some of you who want to complement what you said already, following what the other speakers said, or perhaps you want to ask a question to one of your comrades. So if that's the case, you have the floor. I can't see you on video, but turn on your video and take the floor. But if you prefer to go to questions, there's no problem. Mitzi, would you like to add something? We've lost you again, Mitzi.
No, not really, except that it's just really, really nice to see how everyone is really aligning in the same aspect of justice. It just goes to show that our liberations are tied to each other, even if we're from different countries, different sectors, different companies, or whatever, different fields of work. Everything that we're doing it together, and that's a beautiful thing to see.
Complètement d'accord, Mitzi.
I fully agree with you, Mitzi. I see that we have a question from the participants. Where's the hand? Tutsi Kevin.
Une intervention si tu veux compléter. Et si c'est pour une intervention, voilà, je te laisse 2 minutes. Enfin, pas beaucoup, pour laisser la place aux autres. Merci beaucoup.
D'accord. Bonjour, bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kevin Tuishi. I'm a representative of the CGT, a representative, an interprofessional union in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I would like, first of all, to thank all the speakers. But it is so essential what they mentioned. We have all these issues, and it is not the policies of countries. The policies of the countries are not aligned. Unfortunately, we have some organization, such as the one from Nicolas is a member, which gives some clarifications about climate change policies, but there is a problem because policies which are aligned at the world level through the United Nations organizations, the heads of states of our countries have to take into account this alignment, but such an alignment, it doesn't really answer the global expectations of my country. I live in a country where in some zones we don't even have electricity, and most people in my country use wood. Of course, there is deforestation, but wood is part of their everyday life. They need to make fire, and to do so, they need to cut some trees. And if they don't cut trees, they can't have some fire, they can't prepare their food, they can't build their houses. So the policies defined through the United Nations bodies are completely disconnected with our daily reality. So we try and deal with such issues in our unions, but our leaders who work with our government, with the ILO, even our managers don't take into account this reality. And I think that to take to the streets to speak loud, that won't solve our problems. Of course, that works fine in Europe, but in our country, it doesn't solve anything. To solve a problem, we need to present a solution, and that solution can only be found. For instance, today, we can use gas to heat the house or produce electricity. But, well, if we suggest that solutions, it won't fight climate change without speaking about companies in forest areas in our country. They pollute nature. So this doesn't make the job of local people easier. Sometimes they are just laid off. They are told, well, you have to leave the zone because there is a multinational coming from Europe or the US want to build something which won't bring any guarantees or any solution to their problems. So we don't agree with the international decision-making through the UN bodies. I wanted to stress that, and I must say that I share the viewpoint expressed by Nicolas with his organization 350.org, and it could help us to find a real solution, because there are lots of issues that have to be discussed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. Does one of the speakers can follow suit after this comments?
Okay. Les traductions doivent être finies, donc pas de rebondissement.
So no one. Well, I do understand what you said, Kevin. When some institutions, international institutions, represent companies which exploit people, it is really difficult to rely on such international organizations to have to try and find solutions and an answer to one's problems. Is someone else wanting to take the floor? Amal Al-Durasat, you have the floor. You have the floor, Amal.
Awa Abdourasak. Ah oui, c'est bon.
Allô? Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we do hear you, Awa.
Vous m'entendez, allô? Oui, oui, on entend très bien. On entend très, très bien.
D'accord. Bon, je vous salue vraiment.
First, congratulations for such an initiative, which will enable us to understand many things. I've only been able to join you today because I had technical problems. From the very first day I tried, but it was not possible. In our country, we have so many problems. To follow online courses, it's very difficult. So could you send me the different presentations for me to understand them? Because such training courses are very important for us because they speak about what we experience in our country. So it is indeed a wonderful initiative, and I encourage you to follow these presentations because they'll enable you to understand what is going on in our different countries. So thank you very much, comrade. Thank you, comrade. I think that we have planned to have the presentations for the different roundtables. I don't know how it's going to be sent to you. Sebastian might be able to speak about it. But to meet, even online, is really essential to try and find a solution beyond our borders. So unless someone has another question, I had myself a question to raise, a question about the means. Frédéric, are you still there? You spoke about organizing a huge colloquium. What about the means, the financial means, but also the time necessary to organize it? How do you do to manage that? Or perhaps that question is for all the speakers. Obviously, it's a huge endeavor. When it's online, it's not very costly, but what we try and build is face-to-face meetings, which involves flights. So apart from the pollution problem, there is the money problem, and it is not part of the priorities of the main federations. We are not the most visible, let's say, in unions. So we don't really have access to funds, particularly for countries which experience problems themselves. So we work with associations, our American comrades. We are trying to see whether we could have a solidarity action. We are going to try and find some subsidies for the young, for instance. We had access to a European program. International exchanges is not the priority of many. It is considered as a hobby, a luxury. So it is really a real problem for our sector. If I take other sectors in Solidaires or in our discussion with the CGT, there are activities which are more likely to get funding than ours. You're right. I share your point of view. There is another obstacle mentioned by Mitzi. So Mitzi, perhaps you could come back. It is the obstacle of language, culture, organization. You said it takes a lot of time. So could you give us a piece of advice for those of us who are trying to organize this and organize this event?
It is very difficult. I think we're also still just learning. For calls like this, having interpreters like this one is very, very important. But I understand that resources is also something that's very difficult. What we've been trying to do in the meetings where we can't have interpreters is we help each other translate. So we have to make sure that there's at least one other person who can speak that language, who can translate for other people. It's definitely very difficult. In our messaging spaces, we have like translator bots that will automatically translate. But again, those translators are sometimes not the best also because they're automatic. But it's definitely something that you can only work toward if you're all aware that it brings an obstacle, that if you cannot speak English, then there is a systemic barrier there. And once people start to realize that, then they're also a bit more patient and willing to learn and understand when people cannot speak English. In terms of time zones and cultural barriers, it's also that it's a lot of patience with each other and acknowledge that we're still learning. And remembering that there is no perfect time zone. And sometimes you'll have to do 2 calls, 2 schedules so that both at least more people in each time zone can be accommodated more. And for cultural barriers, that one is a bit more difficult because I think, as Beatrice mentioned earlier, the systems of colonization and capitalism and injustices and the patriarchy do bleed into our systems also and into our structures because that's how society works. And so we have to constantly be aware of it. And so sometimes the white supremacist or Eurocentric view does bleed in a lot into Fridays for Future because it did start in Europe. But what we do is we have spaces for our Black, Indigenous, and people of color activists. We have spaces for our activists from the Global South. We have spaces for our Muslim activists. And that way there is a safe space for them to talk to each other without that fear of people not understanding, of people not knowing what they're saying, and just a place to consolidate each other and talk to each other and then come together as a strong voice when talking to the non-margin, the more privileged sectors of our activists. And I think that safe space is very important because then it gives you a place to collect with each other and to connect with each other and to go stronger together, but not to like separate ourselves from our more privileged counterparts, but rather so we are a more united voice so that we can help our more privileged counterparts see their privilege even more.
Merci beaucoup. Encore un bel exemple au final.
Thank you very much. Once more, it is an example which shows us how we can then learn how to talk together. There's a huge debate about that in France, and it is fed by the far right, but I'm sure that this is a very efficient way of working. So some questions now from the participants, or is it that you're going to let me ask all the questions? Fine. So if you can't find your raise hand function, you can just take the floor now. Otherwise, I'll ask another question. I have a whole stock of them. So we have union organizations, non-union organizations, and I'm quite happy to see that we stress that we have to be hand in hand to solve the main problems of our generation, the climate, or gender equality. amongst the speakers or the participants, would you have perhaps examples of problems between associations, unions, political associations? Do you have some advice to help us to overcome such problems, to work better together? Is there a speaker? Beatrice.
All right. Well, your question is very difficult, and I wouldn't like to, to give you advice, because what applies in one context doesn't have to really apply in other contexts. And sometimes at the union movement, there are also different interests with different unions. So there are unions with which you will be able to work perfectly well, and some others in which you will not be able to do so. And there will be also issues that you will be able to agree with some unions, and some issues that will not, will be completely out of the question. So if I could tell you, I don't know, not advice, I wouldn't dare do that much, but just if you really want to work with let's say with unity with other unions, you should strictly focus on those things you have in common. Strictly. Otherwise, everything that you don't have in common will be an obstacle towards a common fight. With the feminist movement, that was difficult too, especially with the labor strikes that I mentioned, because some unions didn't want to, in Spain, didn't want to legalize formally, to register formally a strike, a 24-hour strike for women, and they wanted, and in fact they did, register a strike for less. But still, apart from that conflict, we feminists have to overcome all those difficulties and concentrate strictly on what unifies us. And I think, Arthur, that could be applied in everything. It is sometimes difficult because, I mean, after you've had an unexpected response by one of the unions, something that you didn't ever imagine that this could happen, even in that context, you should move forward and try to overcome those differences and try to work as commonly as possible. And if that is not possible, don't get obsessed about that, because you will always be able to work with somebody else. If you cannot work with somebody, don't worry, there will be somebody else you will always be able to work with. And in fact, many of those people you cannot work with in the first place may change their minds on the way to the fight. So never give up, basically. That's all I can tell you.
Merci beaucoup, Beatrice.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Let me give the floor to Nicolas now. I thought what Beatrice said very interesting, but I wanted to share our own experience, because the organization 350.org, which wants to put an end to the fossil industry, well, our aim is to get rid of it, because there is no true future which can be considered extractivism, if it goes on, is just not the right thing to do. And once you've made that claim, you have to also see how you can dismantle this sector, which has provided a lot of jobs And so there are some clashes. For example, in Germany, the issue relating to coal is really very conflictual. And it's not so much a clash between activists from the climate movement and trade unionists. No, I think that is not what is really at issue. It's much wider. For instance, if you go in a coal area in Germany, that famous coal area, well, the football club bears the name of the coal industry, and everything is linked to that coal industry in that given environment. And obviously, the managers of these highly polluting organizations understood that they could build on that, they could take advantage on that, and they could actually make sure that there is no true cooperation between the environmental activists and people who work for those organizations. And yet, those organizations in that sector, in the coal mining, for example, are building down the number of jobs. But the managers will say, look, dear workers, your real enemies are the environmental activists. So we have to be very clear on this. When we have claims, they must be based on justice, on true allegations rather than on CO2 emissions. You know, if you look at Amazon, Tesla, Musk, Apple, their vision of the future is a future where there are only renewable energies, where there are no more fossil energies. But we don't want that future. That would make us into a Uber community. We have to be very careful. And the different environment which have been, the environment which has been described is very clear. We need to actually support certain activities like, for example, certain energies, because we need those energies to move on. Some people say there's no job on a dead planet. Yes, that is a fact, that is true, but there are many nuances in between. And it seems that it's better to have a living planet without any jobs, but I believe you can have a living planet with jobs. So we haven't got, we need to take that into perspective. What we are actually recommending is not to destroy all those jobs in those fossil sectors. We just want to make it quite clear that we're trying to move on. And of course, we meet with quite a few opponents, but we're in favor of greening, of course. And the idea is to take into considerations the concerns of the population at large. It is too easy to divide people who share a lot in common. So let us be very careful. Let these attempts not be successful. Thank you. Thank you very much. I believe that the sector of renewable energy will be able to recruit a lot of people and create a lot of jobs. And the management of these industries bring up a different narrative. Let us not believe it. So there, Sebastian, maybe would you like to briefly introduce certain things which have been mentioned? Sebastian? Yes, if we have a little time, as our panel discussion is very close to the one which will deal with coalition and alliances, which will start at 3:30, coalitions and alliance will discuss different activities in the field of environment, but also in other fields. And Nicolas mentioned quite rightly that it is sometimes very difficult to find the appropriate approach. We must have an approach which is built on trust. So this afternoon's last panel discussion will be dealing with coalitions and alliances, and tomorrow we will end at 12 Paris time with a last panel discussion. Sorry, the last panel discussion will take place or start at 2 p.m. on Saturday. It's the end of our forum, but it's not the end of the whole process. We were focusing on the COP 26 in Glasgow, but there are many topics we have been discussing in this forum which will remain very topical. Now, I was very interested by the various panel discussions which have taken place. And of course, all the presentations will be made available to the people who attended these panel discussions. There are video recordings which are also available. You will also find a so-called best of these various panel discussions. And in addition, you will find some documents. They are available online. Each panel discussion had been prepared during a long process, which was a participative and democratic process. So we have 15 minutes left. Please do go ahead and ask questions if you wish to, or make comments. Thank you. Maybe I could give the floor to Jan or Ivan. Sorry, Arthur. I just wanted to mention that tomorrow, the panel discussion on solidarity will start at 1 p.m. Paris time, 1 to 2:30, and then until 17 hours or 5 p.m. we have the General Assembly, the closing General Assembly. Thank you. I have a question to Ivan. I hope Ivan is still around. Ivan, I'm not sure you're still connected. Ivan Milik? Yes, there you are. Okay, let me ask a question. Earlier, you mentioned that the migrant workers you work with and you try to unionize are mainly concerned by their salary. And you mentioned the fact that environmental aspects are of little importance to them or little concern. Could you maybe discuss this a little bit further? Yes, certainly. These issues relating to ecology, they are issues we can discuss with these migrant workers, but when talking about the priorities of any trade unions, you may be aware of the fact that, of course, salary is an important factor. You must know also that salaries are very low, and except Moscow or St. Petersburg, the average salary in Russia can be around 200 or 300 euros. That's very low. And that is why, obviously, the main motto of our struggle is to increase salaries. Of course, if there is any safety issue, security issue, we also work on that. Now, of course, we can discuss ecology or the environment, and there will be interest, but the trade union has to have some power, has to have a lot of members for them to become interested in issues such as the environment. And possibly our members, are facing some difficulties at present, but what they are really interested in is their pay, how to actually be able to feed their families. So there are other issues on a daily basis, which are the main concerns of these migrant workers. And obviously the environment may be secondary, but in the future, the issues relating to the environment will become more important. For instance, issues relating to plastic material. That is something which has arrived. It's only quite recent that plastic is being recycled in Russia, but in small villages, you can still see a lot of plastic bags, etc. You see them dump everywhere in the forest, etc. At the moment, it's not really an issue which is of great concern or great interest. But there are other aspects, for example, if you think about water, there are lots of areas where you wonder how people use water, how they actually extract water, whether they have access to water for agricultural purposes, whether new buildings are being built somewhere where water was actually being won, issues relating to the products that are used in the construction sector. Well, of course, these are all concerns we can further discuss. Thank you. I now give the floor to Mitzi.
I just wanted to say that I definitely agree with Ivan. It is very, very valid that workers across the world feel very separated from the environmental struggle right now. It's something we've encountered a lot here in the Philippines, not just with workers, but when working with the urban poor communities and with our farmers and with our fishing communities, because with so many problems happening in countries like the Philippines, where people are more worried about what they're going to eat, where they're going to sleep, then why should we Filipinos care about the climate, something that's happening, that's been portrayed in the media as a problem of the future? And so the way we do it here as youth climate activists is we are the ones who join the campaigns of the workers, of the farmers, of the fishing communities. We have to be the ones, youth climate activists have this duty to support the campaigns of the more basic sectors of society, because the campaigns, your campaigns, like the campaigns of workers, will ultimately help the campaigns of the climate. Because essentially the same system that's built off of overproduction and exploitation of our workers is the reason why the climate crisis is happening. It's the reason why there's so many emissions and why the world is warming. And so the same system that's exploiting, that's causing the climate crisis is what's exploiting workers. And so the workers' struggle to dismantle that system is ultimately going to help the climate struggle. So this isn't necessarily something that everyone in Fridays for Future agrees with, but me personally, and here in the Philippines, we don't think that we should be getting workers to join us. It's the opposite. We join you. We join the struggles of the masses, of the farmers, of the fishing communities, of the indigenous peoples, of the workers, of the women, because these fights, these struggles ultimately will help in our fight for the climate. And later on, once we've built that connection, once we've built that relationship with each other, then we can talk about the climate. But when we're talking to our workers, we talk to them about their workers' rights. I've spent several weeks with picket lines and workers' strikes here in the Philippines, really kind of just experiencing it with them and living with them and understanding their situation. and just talking about them and their rights. And then later on, since we already had that relationship, we talked to them about the climate also and what they're already experiencing and what they're already seeing. And I think that's what's so important, that we're willing to see each other as friends, as co-organizers, as comrades towards a better future, not like a workers' movement and environment movement, but really a people's movement.
Parfaite intervention.
That was a perfect intervention.
Well, I think you say in a nutshell,
these last two interventions, we really highlight
what
the
has
importance of the International Forum. It's really important to find these common denominators, these common points which were highlighted today. It's really interesting.
Ryan, do you want
like
to take the floor?
come in?
There's a question raised. David,
Ryan,
quickly, so that we may conclude afterwards.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry for Ryan. I think that
Ryan.
David has a question. David Boyce. Thank you for this timely meeting. I come from the World Union Federation of Public Services. For the issues of inequalities, discrimination, marginalization of communities, climate, we have to be aware of the importance of a universal access of quality public services. And it is quite a wide offer of public services. And of course, the neoliberal approach wants to reduce, to base it on commercial exchange and not on a collective effort for communities, for health, education. And to speak about the climate, it is clear that market actors look for profit. They won't solve the problem, they are part of the problem. So we have to build public services and our democracies which are threatened by this tendency to the right, but there are also some specific fights: debt, free trade treaties, debt. This is all part for our fight, and I'm in this forum to try and go together towards the realization of our common future, because we must put an end to such liberalization. Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, no one, it's in no one's interest to fight on his own. The fight is for all, in all companies, for all who are affected by climate change, for all women, some suffering from patriarchy, for all the former colonies who suffer from this new form of colonialism. And we realize that we'll all have to work together. And what makes me happy in this forum, I've taken part to different roundtables. I think that it is possible to do it. It might take some time, of course, but when I've heard all the presentations, the questions that were raised today, I think that we are able to communicate together and to make progress together. As Beatrice said, let's try and find commonalities, and perhaps you wanted to take the floor. You've turned on your video. No, it was just to say goodbye. Okay. So I'm really delighted to see that this is possible, that we've all understood that we had no choice but to work together anyhow. I hope we'll keep in touch. I see that someone called Pierre was putting links. It is the kind of initiative which could be useful to identify. So I invite you to get connected, to go and see what initiatives exist, to tell us about your fights. Let's break these walls between organizations so that we may work together, whatever our country, our nationality, our job, our sex. Let's remain positive. We are absolutely up to it. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for taking part. And for those of you who take part to other round table, very good. And see you soon when we take to the streets or in video conferencing or perhaps face-to-face meetings. Or Sebastian, you can add the link. I've put it right at the top, so I think that you can find it. And I would like to thank you all for being there, the members of the panel from all over the world, the speakers, and as usual, the interpreters, which who make our work possible. And see you in half an hour for those of you who want to take part to the next roundtable. I've put the link for the table on coalition and alliances. So thank you for the link for the forum, where you'll find all useful information in various languages. And don't hesitate to contact delivery men and all those who take part. So have a good evening or good morning, whether depending on when you are, and see you very soon.